those who are in the schools are superior to everybody else. Therefore, other people who are not in the schools are less worthy of empathy. Now, if you're in a boys' boarding school in the 1970s, that means everyone who wasn't a boy, everyone who wasn't wealthy at the private school, it means everybody who wasn't white.
Hello, and welcome to Locked Up Living, a podcast which looks at resilience in challenging organisations, such as, but not only, prisons and hospitals for mentally ill prisoners and patients. My name is David Jones, and together with Naomi Murphy, I present your Locked Up Living podcast.
Really excited to have here Richard Beard, who's an author, and his 6 novels include Damascus, which is a New York Times notable book of the year, and Acts of the Assassins, which was shortlisted for the Goldsmiths Prize. His memoir, The Day That Went Missing, won the 2018 PEN Ackerley Award for literary autobiography. His new book, Sad Little Men, is about his experiences at boarding school from an early age. Welcome, Richard.
Hello, thanks for having me, Naomi.
Richard, you won the Ackerley Award for your autobiographical book, The Day That Went Missing. And you did this after writing a number of novels. Were your novels preparation for writing this and your subsequent book, Sad Little Men?
Well, they certainly helped. I mean, writing novels is a kind of boot camp for becoming a good narrative writer. You have to solve all the problems. You have to learn about characterization and setting, plot, structure. And then when you come to write a non-fiction, all those things come in useful because it's not just remembering what happens, it's telling the story of what happens to try and take the reader with you. So I think, yeah, it definitely helped in that sense before I started out on these non-fiction adventures.
I think you can really hear that in the way I've listened to your book on Audible, so for me it was literally hearing it, and you can hear that in the way that you write. It reads much more like a story than sometimes when you're reading more factually based books. They read just like a list of facts which are held together in a way that doesn't perhaps resonate quite the same way. So it's really powerful in taking that angle.
Well, I think it helps too in terms of telling the story in the sense that interesting things happen to people all the time, but it's a different matter entirely to try and then communicate what they are. And I feel that the novels which I've written, the sort of 20 years of writing I had before these books, was almost like a qualification period, after which I felt ready to address my own life and try and make sense of it and try and say what was important as well, which is always a problem in memoirs, that you have to not just convince yourself, but then convince the reader that it is important. And in this case, or the case of Sad Little Men, I think it is important. It's because what happened to me happened to the people who are leading the country, and therefore we need to know something about them and what formed them.
Do you want to say a little bit about Sad Little Men?
Well, it is about my education in boarding schools, which started in 1975 at the age of 8. And entirely by chance, both David Cameron and Boris Johnson also started boarding at private prep schools in southern England in 1975. So there's a clear coincidence there between the start of my own schooling and their schooling and the style of our schooling as well. And I started to examine, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to go away to school, to effectively leave home at that early age? What does it do to your character? How does it affect you to stay in that system all the way through to the age of 18? And are these things that you're taught in those schools, is it something which stays with you for life? Is it something which you can shake off later? These are all questions which I wanted to address in the book.
It just calls to mind, there was a recent article on the BBC about the fact there's 80,000 pupils in Britain not going to school at the moment because they feel overwhelmed by going to school. I'm just thinking what that must be like for a boy of 8 going away and being away from home, full time. It's quite heartbreaking to think about.
Yeah, the point I wanted to make in the book is well, among many other points, but I did want to stress all the way through that this was my experience of these schools starting in 1975 and going through till 1984, which I think was a particular period for various reasons, partly because of what was going on politically at the time, And also because it was the end of a long period where our schooling in the late 70s was really very similar. You can trace it back to similar things happening in the 50s and the 30s, even as far back as the beginning of the century. So it was a particular period of time. And it's possible that in boarding schools now, the conditions are completely different. I don't think they are completely different because I think there are some things which remain the same. And the one big thing which remains the same is that if you go at an early age to one of these schools, you are separated from your family. And that separation as is now being connected very clearly to psychological theories about attachment theory, which is a major um, theory of 20th century psychiatry, and this sense of abandonment which the children have. I can't see how that can be really very different when the fact of being separated from your family remains the same. I mean, if you have carpets and nice tennis courts and more women around the campus, all those things may change the experience, but that essential fact of separation remains the same.
Yes, indeed. Sad Little Men is quite striking for its many beautiful turns of phrase that are really emotionally evocative, and perhaps more so considering the sort of barren nature of the subject. How did you manage to reconnect with your vulnerability in order to depict your schooling in this way when others might just brush it off?
Well, I think that brushing it off is part of the problem. That's one of the ways in which you can access your vulnerability, by not simply brushing it off. That's what you're educated to do, to say, I was very lucky, I have this privileged upbringing, and therefore I can move on towards great things and achieve great things in my life. But I think one of the ways you don't brush it off is to think about as your life goes on, and certain things may not work out very well. And I'm thinking in particular, one of the areas I trace in the book is in personal relationships, the emotionally guarded nature of children who've been to boarding schools early means that adult relationships are sometimes very difficult to broaden and deepen. And once you start not brushing off these failures, but starting to look at them more closely, then you can start to ask the question, well, am I well educated in that sense? I mean, I'm very well educated in the sense that I can recognize some Latin words, and I went to university, but am I well educated in human relations, in relationships, in empathy, and reaching that emotional vulnerability, as you say, to consider this fairly? I think the answers to those questions need to be pretty have to be faced very squarely, and the answer is often no. I'm not well educated in those kind of ways. And also, in terms of not brushing it off, it's very important to stop making a joke of it, which is something which happens as a defense for people from this kind of background. We see that again in the politicians. It's so easy to make a joke of everything, just as a way of brushing it off and never facing those questions squarely. And that's how to access the vulnerability, I think, to start asking, well, what did my education comprise of? In what ways am I very poorly educated compared to other people?
Yeah, that's very interesting, because it seems to me that in appearance things are brushed off. It may seem as if things are brushed off, but as you described so well in your earlier book in relation to your brother and your own family, things aren't really brushed off. They just become stored up and encapsulated somewhere else in the mind.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write, or I came to write Sad Little Men, because in the previous book, The Day That Went Missing, I described what happened when we went back to school after the summer holidays when my brother Nicky drowned. And the other boys, we went back one day late, and the other boys had all been told the night before that they shouldn't mention it, that would just be cruel to us, and nobody should mention it at all. So we had this strange situation of going back to school just a couple of weeks after he died, and nobody mentioning this fact at all, which clearly meant that we thought we better stop talking about it as well. And when people read that book, they were very interested in that particular episode. And I realised that, especially people who haven't been through this schooling, it's something that they don't know much about, and there was a great interest of know more about it and the detail of what happened in the school and the consequences. And that's really why why I decided, or one of the reasons I decided to write the second book, is realizing that there was something really important there, and there was news that I had. I had this information, about really what's quite a secret world, because people don't talk about it in detail. They're much happier with the broad brushstrokes of, oh well, it was didn't do me any harm, and now I'm prime minister, which isn't very helpful in trying to discuss the effects that this type of schooling has on the pupils who are within it.
Yeah, yeah, extraordinary, really. You write that our schools were totalitarian in the spirit of Hannah Arendt. So can you say a bit about what you mean by this?
Well, I used Hannah Arendt in the book as a as an adult. We were surrounded not just by boys our own age, but very childish adults who'd been institutionalized themselves, teaching in these schools. And so in the book, Hannah Arendt and another writer called Irving Goffman, who wrote a book called Asylums, they are the two sort of presiding adults. And Irving Goffman writes about total institutions, and then that links with Hannah Arendt's totalitarianism. And in the oranges of totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt just wants to show the conditions which can lead to a totalitarian mindset. Essentially, in her case, meaning a mindset where there is little empathy for other people, and therefore injustice and cruelty can thrive. And these schools share some of those characteristics which she writes about in her book. Some obvious examples, I mean, obviously I go into more detail in the book. Some obvious examples are the cult of the strong leader. These schools are usually led by the headmaster, who is looked up to as the one strong leader who can solve all the problems. All the responsibility rests in one person. Other characteristics are the way in which the school encourages ideas of caste, so that those who are in the schools are superior to everybody else. Therefore, other people who are not in the schools are less worthy of empathy. Now, if you're in a boys' boarding school in the 1970s, that means everyone who wasn't a boy, everyone who wasn't wealthy at the private school. It means everybody who wasn't white. And the list really excluded everyone apart from a very narrow band of British society. I'd be tempted to say English society even. And in that sense, the origins of totalitarianism can be traced in these schools as well. Now, the fact that it doesn't lead to totalitarianism, or hasn't yet, is slightly beside the point. I think is that in our own little worlds we are encouraged to be totalitarian, and then that can spread out and seep out through the country, especially as often people from these schools turn out to be the people high up in their professions, and in influential professions. So we have our little totalitarian empires which we carry around with us, and they affect the people we come into contact with in very damaging ways.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, Richard, that I mean, towards the end of your book, you alert your reader to the importance of being prepared for the unexpected, and you draw similarities between Boris Johnson and Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini, which are really quite striking. Could you say a bit more about that for our listeners?
Well, I wanted to point out some similarities, simply because I wanted to follow this thread through between private schools in the 1970s and Hannah Arendt, and there are some things which I just couldn't resist, in the sense that Stalin's Stalin was a boarding school. He was in a seminary in Tbilisi, and he later in his life he asked his mother why he was beaten so often as a child, and she said to him, "Well, it didn't do you any harm." And at the point, he was already the dictator in Russia, responsible for the pogroms and many other horrors. So that's something which is often cited by public school boys in my era as well, that all the beating didn't do us any harm. It's unlikely to be true, just it wasn't for him. Hitler was a fantasist, and we're used to having recently fantasists in our politics, in particular as that relates to Brexit. And Mussolini was a journalist, and was famous for being able to write about any subject taking any side that he chose. So there are all these just interesting parallels. But I should say, and I say this in the book as well, I'm not saying that therefore our public school leaders are itching to become dictators in the mold of Hitler, Stalin, or Mussolini. All I'm saying is that they have characteristics which are not dissimilar, and although they tend towards treating everything as a joke, and it's not just the Johnson I'm talking about here. Is that Cameron, when he turns away from the podium and goes back towards number 10, whistling after he resigns after Brexit. This idea that because they treat everything as a joke, it's quite important that we don't treat them as a joke, just in case. So we should be wary, although at the same time, I wouldn't want to overemphasize those connections.
Thank you. Within your book, you also refer to Stephen Fry crediting boarding school for his ability to survive prison. For people fed on a diet of Harry Potter or Enid Blyton, those kind of like fantasy ideals of boarding school, that might seem quite hard to believe. You've alluded to it a little bit already when you referred to carpets, I think, but can you say a bit more about why Stephen Fry's experience might have helped?
Well, this was quite a common sort of idea through the 20th century. Evelyn Waugh had it as well, and there were a contemporary of George Orwell's said this as well after who was imprisoned in the Second World War in a German concentration camp, saying that boarding school had prepared them for these lives of incarceration. I think in the 1970s, the easy link was to do with physical deprivation, the fact that the food was famously not very good, therefore you'd be used to prison food, probably brought from the same suppliers. And there was the physical punishment as well, the idea that you were physically hardy and could endure any conditions that prison could throw at you. But I think more relevantly, and might still be relevant today when public school boys go to prison often for white collar crimes, is that in these schools you learn your level in hierarchies very easily. It becomes second nature to know where you belong, to know how you fit in, and that's a skill which would be, I think Stephen Fry was suggesting, was very useful in a prison, and I think that's where that would remain true, even if the kind of food and the beatings are much lesser than they used to be.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think quite often the people who struggle in prison are those who resist and fight against authority, and you can't take on the system or beat the system, can you, when it's so powerful? One of the...
I just want to say is that for me, I mean, we had this in the family because my grandfather was a prison officer, and when my mother, who didn't have any experience of boarding schools, first went to the secondary school, Radley College, and looked around, she thought it was less clean than the young offenders institution where my grandfather had been working. So she was shocked. She was shocked that I should be being sent to somewhere where she'd known all her life when she was growing up. The young men who were in these institutions, very similar age actually, kind of 14 to 18, and she really couldn't understand why you would send someone there by choice, and not only that, but pay for it. And it was really against her will, and it was my father who decided this was the best, this would provide the best outcomes for us. But there was in our family that direct connection between prisons and the boarding school.
Well, you're making that link there as well between the age of people being there, and I think you're describing a system that privileged people often choose to subject their children to, and I wonder, is it really then surprising that children who've been taken into the care of local authority have often discussed similar experiences of having this kind of like harsh, austere upbringing? Is it inevitable that they're overrepresented in the criminal justice system, do you think?
But the
people who get boys who get taken into the care of the local authority are overrepresented amongst the prison population, and is it that surprising given the kind of experiences that they have in the sense of feelings perhaps rejected and unloved in these kind of like harsh set of circumstances? Is it surprising they end up in prison? So, people who don't end up in prisons, I'm curious about why boarding school pupils aren't overrepresented in prisons, whereas boys that go into the care of the local authority are more likely to end up in prison statistically. So I'm curious about why that is.
Well, I think that's a question of the outcomes. Is that the idea of the private school and the emotional deprivation in this private school, or if you like, the emotional independence would be another way of describing it. If you were in favour of these schools, the idea is that this hardiness is a good preparation for life, and those schools do make it worthwhile because at the end of the process there are pathways to successful careers and to earn money, and it becomes very tribal. As the once you're in this group, you'll be protected by that group. So the harshness is rewarded. If at the end of that process of emotional deprivation, there's no pathway, then, I mean, it looks very, very bleak. I mean, we were offered bleakness with a reward, but if you're offered bleakness with no reward, then, you know, there you leads to the outcomes which you just described. Um, and I think that's really the answer to it. Is it's grossly unfair. You have the same or similar psychological profiles, but in privileged schools you have a way out of that into the sunlit uplands of material success. If you're in care, and you could say that boarding school children have been in care of a different type, but if you're in local authority care, you just have no gateway at the end of it, and it's just an unfairness.
Yeah, I like that. We talk a lot about pathways in the criminal justice sector, particularly over the past 10 years, where I think people have made efforts to create pathways. But I like your emphasis on the pathways which are laid out at the end of these public schools.
Well, I think that's there. And I mean, there was something else that I wanted to say about that as well. Is that these institutions serve the people who've been through them very well. Is that when the outcomes work out favourably, you think, well, it must be because I was in this kind of institution. If you're thinking of a boarding school, um, uh, and I have to somehow to change that kind of outcome. Is that the people, this is men and women who are going through private education. I say private education, not just boarding education, because most private schools are trying to imitate these boarding schools at the top of the pyramid. And we think everyone always refers to Eton as a shorthand, but there is a pyramid of private schools, where each one is trying to imitate them so that you have the same outcomes. I mean, every private school would like to have a prime minister, would like to have a Lord Chief Justice, would like to have the head of the police. Until this kind of segregation of pupils who go to private school and those who don't is breached, so that there can be movement between the two, or the gateways are the same for no matter which background you come from. I can't see that there are really going to be any changes there in terms of what pathways are open to children coming out of different systems.
I think another similarity with kind of like the experience of people being in the care of the local authority, or certainly for the 70s, that as a therapist you'd look at people's files and you'd be anxious that that meant someone had a history of sexual abuse in terms of their experience. And you quote some pretty shocking statistics on sexual abuse in boarding schools in your book. Do you think the introduction of safeguarding has helped change that culture?
Well, I think it definitely has. After the 2009 Children Act, clearly safeguarding has made a difference in private boarding schools and private schools more generally. I felt I had to include sexual abuse in the book because it was a factor of 1970s and early 1980s schooling. There wasn't a school that didn't have its own story of usually a teacher who had disappeared suddenly. Now, even if that abuse wasn't widespread, it was there in the air, it was there in the atmosphere. But I didn't want to go into specific stories in the book because I do think that apologists for private schools sometimes seize on this and say, yes, well, sex abuse is terrible. Everyone can agree on that, and everyone does agree on that. but then they can blame any shortcomings of these schools on a few bad apples, as if that's the only thing which is wrong. And in some ways, apologists for the schools like talking about the sexual abuse, I think, for that reason, because it's a way of distracting from other problems which remain and which were there at the time and may well have continued, into the present day. So that's the reason I don't go into any sort of great detail about that. There are other books that do that, and they are horrific. But I do think it's sometimes used just to distract from other issues which also need addressing. There's damage caused in these schools even without the sexual abuse, but then you have to add the sexual abuse as being something in the air on top of that.
I was quite shocked. I don't know why I'm so shocked, really, but because I guess as with the various churches that have had their sexual abuse scandal, to see that people who were complicit, didn't do anything about abuse at the time, have then subsequently been made, for instance, the teacher responsible for safeguarding in schools later, and you think, well, you've managed to turn a blind eye previously to these sorts of things happening. So, and we know that the culture of institutions often persists even when the personnel change. So there was quite a lot of research on that. So that the culture is persistent. So yeah, I was just curious about whether that had changed as a consequence.
Well, I mean, as I was saying earlier, I mean, I'm in the book, I'm talking about this specific period, sort of 75 to the mid 80s. I imagine that it has changed to a certain extent, but at the same time, these schools do need to examine the culture which does allow certain practices continue until they're forced to change. With, for example, the 2009 Children Act, there was no sense that the schools were going to change it themselves. And in Alex Renton's book, Stiff Upper Lip, he actually records very effectively the fact that when a teacher was moved on for sexual abuse, they could go and get employment somewhere else in another private school. And that was something which therefore had to be changed by outside intervention. And one does wonder how many other things now can only be changed by outside intervention. Corporal punishment was another one, which is really just pressure from outside, which forced it to end. And because they are closed institutions, and in fact, complaints about abuse still don't need to be reported outside the school. It is hard to know what else needs to be changed by outside intervention, and I wouldn't be able to say. I'm not an expert on that, but it seems unlikely that the culture has become perfect in the last 30 years.
Well, you can see some interesting parallels, I think, with what's happening with the Met Police at the moment, and these questions about, the assumption being that the police's stance being about one or two bad apples, when in fact people are talking about a much more pervasive culture that allowed these kind of conversations to happen, which clearly link to misogyny. So again, I think that's just about the culture. But David, I think you had a question.
Okay, yeah. We were struck by your recollection of the boy in the documentary The Making of Them, who had to be sedated each term to return to school. And how does a child recover from that? What kind of coping strategies are required? And are rates of suicide higher for former boarders?
I'll just deal with that last question first. Is that, as far as I know, there isn't quantitative research into a question like that. Are there higher rates of suicide for former boarders? In the book, I write about 2 or 3 cases that I know about personally, and which have affected me personally, and therefore it is clearly something which happens. That research doesn't exist, and I also think that in terms of the effect of these schools, and that's not just in the 70s, but now, I think there needs to be research done into how these children end up, not just at age 18, because the research seems to end pretty much at what A levels they get and what universities they go into. But it needs to be research at 25, 35, 55. What happens to these children who have had this education when they're 60? I think that would be a very interesting research to do, because there might be some surprising results which would deter parents from thinking this was the best option for their children. But in terms of the coping strategies that you talk about for dealing with this confusion that comes from being separated from your family to go to school and to sleep at school um, for months at a time. I mean, an obvious coping strategy is you start to think it's very difficult to trust people who love you, because the people who love you, your family, have said, well, we love you very much, but we're now going to leave you here and drive off in the car and we'll see you in a month. Um, and a coping strategy just becomes, well, I'm not really going to trust anybody who says, um, I love you, I want what's best for you. Believe me, this will be for the best in the long run. So a coping strategy becomes to be very emotionally defensive. And that's something which can stay with you, all your life unless you consciously try to address it.
Yes, indeed. That's very, very powerful. So this next question is a bit of what the lawyers would describe as a leading question, I think. Evidence suggests that approaches to social problems such as crime, homelessness, unemployment, that are more compassion focused are more likely to be successful than a more punitive approach. But we haven't yet seen that really penetrate the justice system. Are we likely to see much evidence of a more compassionate approach from a cabinet of former boarding pupils?
Well, I think again this applies to, if you're saying a cabinet of former private school pupils. Not all of them are boarding, but I think the private schools they're in can be put in the same category because it's emulation of the boarding schools. And I think if you're looking for a more compassionate approach from their own experience, um, certainly to those who were educated at the same time as me, I think that's quite unlikely because there are limitations to our empathy. Um, because of this cased cast of mind, which I was talking about earlier, and this assumed superiority over others, it means that the problems of others are problems to be solved. They're not really problems to be felt, and therefore short-term solutions feel like a solution because then you just don't have to think about it anymore. So if until there's any real empathy or compassion to create the solution, I don't see how there'd be the long-term solutions to these social problems. But while it's just a problem to be solved until the next election, then nothing really changes because there's no real empathy there. But we were trained not to feel empathy. We were trained not to feel for the suffering of others, and that comes right from the beginning. The day when you're left there for the first time at school, and you are told basically not to feel sorry for yourself, not to feel empathy for yourself, not to feel homesick, not to cry because your parents have driven away. And that sort of lack of feeling that you have to learn to show for yourself becomes a lack of feeling for others. And I think, therefore, those compassionate solutions are further out of reach for people educated in this way than perhaps for others.
Yeah, it's really hard to think about that experience, and just overriding that need. How sad that must be for those boys. And when I think about that, and then also there are three other points you make very eloquently that leave me feeling quite pessimistic really for the criminal justice system and any other state institutions like education. So you talk about the love of structure, being past focused and valuing compliance over critical thinking. And that makes me wonder, is there any hope of politicians devising more creative solutions to justice and education, so long as we're governed by former boarding school, or as you might say, more former private school educated people?
Well, I think it's unlikely because in terms of justice and education, those who have these privileged pathways and end up at the top think that the world is very just. And they also think their education was very fine because they end up in positions of power. Therefore, they don't really have any vested interest in questioning those structures, and that's going to be a problem, especially if they're not feeling for people outside their segregated world. But I did call the book "Sad Little Men" because I agree with what you're saying at the beginning. I think it is very sad, and that's not just kind of an angry attack on these people. There is a sadness there, and they are little because they are still children. They are reacting to the world like the children that they were, and they were sad children, and therefore they're defensive and they're wary. And I think another consequence of that is to be very wary of change. because it could get even worse, and that's something you certainly don't want when you're being run by this sad little child inside yourself, and yet you're pretending to be a strong and upstanding man, in most cases men, in terms of certainly the prime ministers we've seen recently from boarding school backgrounds. So I can't see really that it's going to change until there's a vested interest in it changing, and you can break away from this kind of training.
Do you think being so past focused has got anything to do with the accusations of institutional racism, sexism and homophobia that plague institutions like the police, the prison service and so on?
Well, I think that's where the timing is relevant, in the sense that when people in positions of power now, who are in their mid-50s, early to mid-50s, as I am, when we were being educated, this wasn't past focused. I mean, we were surrounded by racism, sexism, homophobia. We had the language, we used the language. We were just racist, sexist and homophobic every day of the week. Now, however much we've tried to reform as time has gone on, that residue is there, and now we're much more aware of unconscious bias. But anyone of my age who says they don't have unconscious bias, I find that impossible to believe, because we were so immersed in this. And although the cultures can change in the Met Police, you were mentioning before, you say in the prison service or in schools, I think it can change, but it's going to change slowly, because those of us who face this every day are still in charge, and it's something that we don't fully appreciate, I think, because of that. So maybe if we wanted to change in that instance, we just have to wait for the culture to change, or people like us have to get out of the way, but there's no sign of that happening.
No, not much. So, thank you, Richard. One of the things we like to ask our guests at the end of the interview is how they've managed to keep themselves emotionally nourished when things are quite challenging. I'm guessing the little boy in your book would have quite a different answer to the man you are now.
I don't think so, because I think from quite an early age I started reading as a way to be emotionally nourished. And what I loved about reading, in fiction in particular, was the idea I was learning about someone else's life, and nearly always completely different from my own, and it gave me hope, and it gave me emotional nourishment. It gave me access to feelings that I didn't have at school, and to this day I love reading, and I love reading a love story, because these are different lives, and it makes me feel that different lives are possible. And not only do I read fiction, I believe in it, and I like to believe in the happy endings, and that's where I found my emotional nourishment, and that's never really changed.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. One of the reasons I enjoy doing these conversations with Naomi is that Naomi is a great reader, so she's introduced me to your books, and I'm really looking forward to reading more of them. Thanks a lot, Richard.
Great. Well, thanks very much.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much.
So Richard's obviously written some wonderful books, and the book about his own brother and the death of his own brother is extremely powerful. But of course, more recently, he's written about the effects of private and boarding schools upon people. And I thought, well, it reminded me, I saw a Twitter the other day where somebody was writing, or does this government have no empathy at all? And I thought, they need to read the books. Richard's books explain all this. They lay it all out, why this government lacks in empathy.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Richard's got a really beautiful way of writing. You can tell he's a novelist, not just a journalist in terms of his style of writing. So he's got some beautiful turns of phrase within his book, but absolutely exposes why there's that lack of empathy. I suppose that goes then with a sense of bleakness, really, at things changing, because actually how can that system change so long as these schools and the products they churn out at the end are so dominant within society and have so much influence in terms of policy. And that really makes me feel quite hopeless about the possibility of real meaningful change, to have something that's more empathic and more compassionate.
Many thanks again to all of you who have listened to our Locked Up Living podcast. Feel free to mention this to your friends and to your colleagues, and give us feedback on our webpage lockeduplives.com and our Twitter account Locked Up Living. Many thanks too to Pete and Rach, who kindly allowed us to use their music. You Have Called Me Courage, and this is available from all the usual outlets.